What is up, cool kids? I'm Cool Trainer Gavin, and welcome back to part 2 of our 100 subscriber special, the Pokemon Tree of Life thing. I haven't decided what I actually want to call this yet, but anyway, we are here in our new setup. As you can see, we have proper, brick walls, which are good for science, I guess. I have my lab coat. My goggles aren't necessary for this one because we're not delving into too much internal anatomy, because this episode is fairly straightforward. There's not a lot of, having to really dive into the anatomy of some of these Pokemon to figure out what they are. So we're going to be doing probably the basics of animals today. So with that, let's get to it. Now first, at the bottom of the tree, even though I did say last episode that Mew was not the direct ancestor, it is more of sort of like the seed or something along those lines. Mew is at the base, just because I felt that was more appropriate, even though, like I said, it's not the direct ancestor to all Pokemon. Rather, we have Solosis and Reuniclus there at the bottom as well, being sort of roots. You can see we have some that are not quite done. The green leads off to the plant Pokemon, while the yellow leads off to the fungus Pokemon. And the orangish kind of salmon color leads to the start of the animals. And you see, this blue kind of branches off. The branch that goes off to the left with pretty much nothing on it probably should be a different color, but for the sake of there not being any Pokemon in this category, I left it the same color. This is the sponges. There are no sponge Pokemon. Sponges are the most basic group of animals. Just looking at them, you would kind of think that they're similar to coral, which they in some ways are, but they are slightly different in the way that they eat and the way that they just sort of function in general. But there are no sponge Pokemon, so I'm just leaving that branch completely empty. I feel like there are sponge Pokemon in sort of like the mythos, but they just have not been categorized yet. So, moving on from there, we go into the Cnidarians. So, as much as I love Birdkeeper Toby's series, it kind of bothers me how he pronounces some things, which these are fairly hard words to pronounce, so don't get me wrong, I give him a lot of credit. But even though there is a C at the beginning of this word, it is not pronounced whatsoever. This is called the phylum Cnidaria. Cnidarians are generally pretty much just corals and jellyfish, things like that. Sea anemones are also in this, but there are no sea anemone Pokemon. So instead, in this group, we have Corsola, Tentacruel, and Jellicent being the only coral or jellyfish Pokemon. Now, Cnidarians are classified based on their symmetry. In fact, a lot of animals are classified based on symmetry. Most animals either have bilateral symmetry, which means if you cut them, for instance, if you cut them down the middle, they're more or less going to be the same on either side. That is not always the case. For instance, humans have bilateral symmetry. However, like your heart is on your left side, and there's just kind of space here for muscles and veins and things like that on the other side. So it's not quite perfect, but it is how humans are set up symmetrically. However, that is not the case for Cnidarians. Cnidarians have what's called radial symmetry, which means they're more or less set up in a circle, and if you cut them in the middle anyway, as long as it's, a diameter of the circle, they're going to be the same on either side. Whereas, humans, you can cut them in half this way, and we will be the same on either side this way, but if you were to cut us sort of like this, like down through the head, we would not be the same. And that's one of the differences, one of the many differences between things in the phylum Cnidaria as opposed to later animals, which we will get to in later videos. Moving on from here, we have probably the biggest split within the animals, and that is the difference between proterostomes and deuterostomes. Those words might seem kind of scary, but really, all they mean is which opening in your body develops first, your mouth or your butt. It's kind of a silly way to classify things, but that's how science does it. And unfortunately, you and I are deuterostomes, which means our butt develops before our mouth. It seems like something really simple, but it's actually very, very important when it comes to developmental biology, which is, how you develop as an embryo. So, all vertebrates, fish, mammals, birds, whatever, anything with a backbone are all deuterostomes, as well as echinoderms, things like starfish and sea urchins. Any other animal you can think of, things like insects, most other invertebrates are deuterostomes, which means that their mouth develops before their butt. So that is probably the biggest split in the kingdom Animalia. The next group of actual animals that we're going to be talking about are echinoderms. Things like starfish, crinoids, and sea cucumbers. This group is mostly only made up of Pukamuku, which is a sea cucumber, Toxapex, which is a sea urchin, Starmie, which is a starfish, and Cradilli, which is a crinoid. Now, Cradilli is a really interesting Pokemon because it is a grass type, but it is not a plant. It is based off of animals called sea lilies, which are commonly mistaken for plants. And most people just colloquially English, call them sea lilies, but their actual name is crinoids. They are very, very common fossils, which is why Cradilli is a fossil Pokemon. But they are actually animals. They're very neat little animals that have lots of tentacles, like you see in Lily, that just kind of sway and filter feed in the water. But they are, in fact, animals. And they're actually, in the grand scheme of things, quite closely related to you and I. Moving even farther up the tree, we get into the very beginnings of vertebrate life. And that would be Electros. Even though Electros sounds like an eel, it's even got the word eel in its name, it is not an eel at all. It is in fact an agnathid, which is a jawless fish. These fish have no bones. If you've ever seen a hagfish, which I'll try and remember to throw a picture up on the screen, these are jawless fish. These are the first vertebrates, or first real chordates, not directly your ancestors, but we are closely related to them, much closely related to us than they are to things like echinoderms. I put Electros kind of as a tangent, as opposed to directly on the line, and you'll see that several times, because unless something is specifically stated to be the direct ancestor to a group of Pokemon, it's going to be on a branch, not necessarily on the actual tree itself. I think we only see this twice. That would be in when we get into the reptiles, with Caracosta being the direct ancestor to all turtle Pokemon, and Archeops being the direct ancestor to all bird Pokemon. We'll talk about that when we get there. So now we get into the actual fish themselves, things that you normally think of when you think of a fish. Firstly, we have chondrichthyes, which would be fish that have a skeleton made out of cartilage instead of bone, like you and I. These would be, in the real world, sharks, skates, and rays. And in the Pokemon world, there are really only 3. I looked for more, because I felt like that there really should be more, but there's just not. There's Mantine, which is obviously a ray, a manta ray, and we have Sharpedo and Garchomp, which are both sharks. Now, Sharpedo is very obviously a shark. It's got Char in its name from shark. But Garchomp is much less obvious. There's a lot of theories out there, and I think most people generally accept that Garchomp is reasonably closely related to Sharpedo, especially considering its, if not its Pokedex description, definitely Gibble's says it is the land shark Pokemon. And they have a lot of similar color schemes as well, with the star on their face, the blue, and then Garchomp loses like the white on its stomach, but it doesn't really need it because Sharpedo would use that as a sort of camouflage, but that's, getting into a lot of different biology things that we don't need to talk about in this series. But just know Sharpedo and Garchomp are very, very closely related as sharks. So next up we have the bony fish that actually have bones and have scales made of bones. Now, how fish are related is actually quite tricky, and not something that I was incredibly familiar with before doing my research for this project, but I think I have it more or less settled out. Firstly, we have the eels, which would be Huntail, Gorbis, Gyarados, and Milotic. I almost called Gyarados Charizard for some reason. But these are Pokemon that I think are more closely related, basically being just sea serpents. I'm going to call Gyarados an eel rather than a dragon, which come later, just because of its association with water, and the fact that while it can come on land and has been shown to be able to come on land, it is almost exclusively water bound. As is Milotic to an extent. I believe it is similar to Gyarados in that it can come on land, but Huntail and Gorbis definitely cannot. And obviously, being that they evolve from the same Pokemon being Clamperl, Huntail and Gorbis are obviously very closely related. And I think there's always just been a general association between Gyarados and Milotic, being that they evolve from small fish that are frankly kind of useless and evolve into something much, much better. If you look at their stats, they also have the same numbers, just distributed somewhat differently, quite differently, in fact. But I think that could be that, the reason for this could be that Magikarp and Feebas eventually were, or way back in the day, were the same Pokemon, which is why I have Gyarados and Milotic on the same branch. Next up, in a group kind of all on its own, is Whiscash, which is a catfish. There are no other catfish Pokemon, and catfish are pretty well set off from the rest of other kinds of fish, so there were no things that were like super closely related to Whiscash. So I just kind of threw that on its own branch. Then we have Stunfisk. Stunfisk is a really interesting Pokemon in that I really had no idea where to put this thing, because it has parts of it that are somewhat like some of the cartilaginous fish, a member of the Chondrichthyes like Mantine, Sharpedo, and Garchomp were. But by and large, I think it's more based off of a stargazer or a couple other species of like flounder, which are bony fish. So because it was just so different from anything else, I put it on its own branch as well. Next up, we have our seahorses in Dragalge and Kingdra. I say Dragalge, some people say Dragalge. It's whatever. And then we have sort of our lanternfish in Lumineon and Wishiwashi. Wishiwashi, I think, is reasonably close related to Lumineon, simply because it is seen to light up as you, like during the trial in at least Sun and Moon. I'm not sure if Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, but as they are, coalescing to form the totem Wishiwashi, you can see them glowing. And I think that they also glow to signal different things, which I think you can see in the schooled Wishiwashi form, that it kind of lights up at different points. So that is why I put them on the same branch. Then we have our anglerfish in Lantern and Bruxish. I think even though Bruxish does have teeth and looks fairly different than Lantern, I think that the thing on its head could be, it's not that much of a stretch to say that Lantern and Bruxish had a common ancestor in the past that used that to catch prey, such as Lantern does. However, Bruxish just had it modified to be able to hypnotize them with psychic powers instead of just flashing lights. Then on the branch closest to them, we have Alomomola and Luvdisc, which obviously are very closely related, being that Alomomola is a ocean sunfish, and Luvdisc, I'm not really sure exactly what Luvdisc is, but looking at the two you can tell that they're very closely related. As well as we also have Quillfish, which pufferfish are actually very closely related in the grand scheme of things to the ocean sunfish, which I thought was really, really interesting. I did not know that before. And then on the final branch of fish, we have Sea King and Basculin. Basculin, whether it's a piranha or a bass, which I think it really could be either, Sea King is goldfish, and they are both just sort of generic fish. And they are closely related. I couldn't give you what kind of family it is or anything like that because Basculin is a little hard to determine. But I think that they are probably the closest related to each other anyway. And that concludes this episode. We walked into the beginning of vertebrate life. But we have one last fish to discuss before we close this video out. So the last fish, and arguably one of the most important fish in the grand scheme of evolution of the Pokemon world, is Relicanth. I'm not going to bore you with too many scientific names, because frankly you don't really care about them, and you probably wouldn't even know how to spell most of them. But, not that I'm insulting your intelligence, just that they're quite long Latin words, so sorry. All of the other fish that I've talked about in this episode have been what are called ray-finned fish, whereas Relicanth is what's called a lobe-finned fish. If you look at most fish, such as a perch or a carp or something like that, if you look at their fins, they have sort of bony rays that make them up. whereas things like relicanth, which is based off of the coelacanth, it's called a living fossil because people thought it was extinct until the early to mid 1900s when somebody fished one up. But they actually have muscles and bones in their pectoral fins that can allow them to move. Some ray-finned fish also have this, things like mud skippers, but this was a huge advancement. And as you can see, relicanth is very close to the next group, which would be amphibians. Similar to how I put Electros as a branch as opposed to directly on the tree, I don't think that all what are called tetrapods, basically vertebrates that aren't fish, evolved directly from relicanth, rather something that was very closely related to relicanth. So relicanth is an extremely important Pokemon in this tree. That is going to wrap up this episode. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below about where I kind of put things. If you had some things that you thought should be on this list, or if you had some things that, I discussed today as part of the fish or Nidarians or Echinoderms that you think should be somewhere else, let me know. So if you enjoyed this video as much as I did, please like and or subscribe. Follow me on Twitter and Twitch at CoolTrainerGav, and until next time, smile later.